Good evening.
Good evening.
I hereby call this December 12th meeting of the Public Safety Committee to order. Before we move to our consent agenda, I always like to take a moment and recognize our public safety personnel for the work that they do, keeping us safe day in and day out in our communities. We have some representatives here from our three departments. I don't see Mr. Sadler, but he's always normally here, so I just want to recognize him, Mr. Sadler, who is the Director of Emergency Management. I see our Fire Chief, Chief Mayo is here representing our Fire Department. I also see our Police Chief, Chief Roundtree in the back representing our Police Department. Of course, we're joined by our City Manager, Lee Garrity, and our Public Safety Attorney, Ms. Sykes, led by the Attorney's Office, Ms. Attorney Carmen. So with that being said, members of the committee, I understand that we have a need to hold item G1, item G2 in committee. So we'll hold those, if it is the pleasure of the committee, until the January meeting. So that leaves us item G3 to be considered today. If there is no objection to that, we'll move to the consent agenda. Items on the consent agenda are unanimously approved unless a council member or committee member wishes to be pulled for consideration. Members of the committee, are there any consent agenda items to be pulled for discussion? Seeing none, I entertain a motion.
Move approval of consent agenda items C1 through C3.
It's been motioned. Is there a second?
Second.
And properly seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
That is unanimous. Thank you. Item G3, please.
Item G3, ordinance amending section 42-154D of the City Code related to handicap parking.
And giving us just a little bit of information before we have the discussion is our Assistant City Manager, Mr. Greg Turner. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, last month you had some discussion about on-street handicap parking. The direction from the committee was to go back and for staff to come up with a concept for you to consider that would allow for on-street designated handicap parking. We have done that. In essence, what the ordinance would provide is a one parking space per block authorized by the council to be installed after review and determination as to best location of the city's transportation department. We felt that it was appropriate for council to pass a ordinance, if you choose to do so, to clarify or to authorize this sort of parking. The public speakers who were here last month are here again. We've had conversation back and forth. They have a desire for more spaces, but we thought that one space initially would be appropriate for a staff recommendation. Be happy to answer any questions you may have. There are logistical issues and details that would obviously need to be worked out. We didn't feel it was appropriate to incorporate those into the ordinance. It's one of the reasons why the decision is left to the city's Department of Transportation Director to identify whether on-site improvements are necessary and what the best location for those parking spaces would be. Happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. Just one question for consideration. It is currently our ordinance that there is one handicap parking space per 25 spaces. Is that correct?
If you're talking about off-street parking,
Off-street parking.
there is a table that has that option, or excuse me, has that requirement in it. The table also has indications for what the handicap parking is for larger parking lots. And by the time you get to a parking lot that's, let's say, 100 parking spaces, I think the rate drops to 2%. But there is a table that is provided by the feds to indicate how many parking spaces should be provided. And if, in fact, you have 25 spaces, then that would call for one parking space. As a matter of information, a typical street in the downtown area, because of block lengths, has between 10 and 20 spaces in a block.
Members of the committee, there is no one signed up at this time to speak about this item. Do you have any questions for Mr. Turner currently? Oh, I saw Mayor Pro Tem Burt hands first, then we'll come to Mr. McIntosh. Mayor Pro Tem Burt.
Thank you. I was going to ask, we don't know where they will be right now. You're just giving us a boundary.
That is correct. And what we feel is that the decision on specifically where they would be in each block should be left to the staff, as you have already done when you delegated authority for the installation of parking restrictions throughout the city. There are lots of detailed decisions that have to be made as to the viability of a location. And so council decades ago delegated that authority to the city staff.
Well, it's nice that we've done that. Things do change, but I think the city manager, that our chairman or our vice chairman should have a close communication before this even comes to a regular because maybe they may have some information that some of the citizens may have told them, and then you're looking at where it's going to be handicapped people, how far they may have to walk and all of that. So I think we need to use an exception with this one, please. And also, Mr. Chairman, I do believe you need to recognize your transportation director, Mrs. McCullers here.
Well, I think it's a wonderful time to stop and do that. We're coming to Mr. McIntosh. If you'll just belabor us for a moment. I'd like to recognize our Transportation Director, Ms. Tony McCullough. So thank you for being here as well, and forgive me charging to my mind and not to my heart.
Mr. Sadler.
And Mr. Sadler is now here. Thank you, Mr. Sadler.
President accounted for.
Councilmember McIntosh.
Even though staff has the ability to designate these spaces, I imagine that decision would not be made in a vacuum, and that there are plenty of stakeholders that
Absolutely.
that need to be consulted in this.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah. And so I'm assuming the usual suspects will be involved and their opinions asked. But what is the group that we're going to?
Downtown development, the adjacent property owners, any special users of that block, for instance. We have numerous times when we have requests for loading zones, and so if we have something like that that would be impacted, not by removal, but just by the location in close proximity or the relocation of a loading zone, we'd have to work with the property owners that are using or depending on that loading zone, as an example. But,
Right. School of the Arts, obviously, because of the Stevens Center, would be involved in the
that would be an
conversation.
adjacent property owner.
Right. So people who depend on parking facilities for their clients and/or employees who park on the street.
We also would consult with the chairman of the committee as well as the council member of the ward.
Right.
Typically.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Larson. Councilmember Larson.
Thank you. Thank you. How are we defining the downtown? In other words, for each block, we're saying one parking place per block is authorized. So
Correct.
how are we defining, is it the parameters of what blocks? Is it 4th Street, 5th Street?
Martin Luther King Jr. Drive to the north, Business 40 to the south, Research Parkway to the east, and Broad Street to the west.
Okay, so each of those blocks would be authorized a handicap parking space
All roads within that boundary, yes, sir.
within that boundary. Do we have the discretion to, if whatever that means, 32 parking spaces, just say, whatever it is, do we have the discretion to take from Peter and put from Paul? In other words, do we have to have one per block, or areas that are more intensively used perhaps for retail spaces as compared to manufacturing areas or something? Would we have the ability to adjust multiple parking spaces in an area that might be more applicable, or is it going to be strictly one per block?
The max is one per block as written in this proposal. The intent was not in the proposal to try to group them all together and make one area
I'm not trying to group them all together. I'm just saying, do we have the flexibility where we might see the need for more than one in a block to be able to do that under this ordinance?
not as proposed. Certainly, there's flexibility that the committee could put in, but as proposed, it's not in there.
So the second question would be, if the Stevens Center is having a special event, would they have the ability, for example, to take some public streets and designate handicap parking on their own under any program that we allow, that just for that night or that event, rather than for all the time?
No, the only thing that they would be able to do, I think, would be to get an exhibition or block party permit, something that would close the road to the general public, and then they might be able to use that to provide their access. One of the other things I should re-mention here is that remember that all spaces downtown, all spaces on public streets are available for handicap parking with no time restriction, as long as it's a general use space. Loading zones that I alluded to earlier obviously aren't that. But if you have a standard space that has a 2-hour parking restriction on it, then a vehicle with a handicap placard or tag is allowed to park there for an unlimited amount of time.
The question is finding that empty spot, which is part of the problem.
Attorney Carmen, did you want to weigh in?
No, I was just confirming what Greg said, the maximum is one per block.
But I could have one on this corner, and then right across the street I could have another.
That is correct.
So I'd have two within 40 feet of each other.
I guess if that's how you divide the block.
Correct. It would be Let's say that you're on 4th Street. You could have one on the north side, one on the south side, and they would be 20 feet apart.
And that's where the stakeholder input is so important, where
That's exactly.
where they really need it.
So how are we engaging the handicapped community? I understand you're talking to merchants and everything. What is the mechanism for?
We've only had conversation thus far with Ms. Dennis to share with her this version.
Right.
And she had desire for more spaces, but we felt that this was the appropriate starting point for the committee.
Have you exhausted your questions?
Up for now.
Mayor Pro Tem Burke.
Yeah, I was going to say, with his, Councilman Larson, do we know now how many more handicapped people we have who will be using the spaces than when we first got started? And then also engage in the handicapped community. Who are the spokespeople for them?
We've only heard from the citizen who spoke to the general committee, and that was Ms. Dennis.
I was thinking, besides Ms. Dennis, do you have an association?
There is. The mayor's committee.
Coalition on
I know
Disabilities.
that. That's why I'm saying, looks like we
Yes.
need to be talking
Yes,
to
ma'am.
somebody.
Exactly.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Burke. And what I've gathered from just sort of listening is there's a lot of stakeholders, Councilmember Larson, Councilmember McIntosh, and Mayor Pro Tem Burke, that need to be at the table when we have this conversation. I just want to thank, the citizen for bringing this to our attention. This doesn't stop here, but I think when we make a decision like this, it is definitely prudent to include everybody at the table before we make a decision. And my favorite line is, we always measure 10 times and cut once. Are there any questions at this time for Mr. Turner before we sort of discuss the pleasure of the committee? Seeing none, what is the pleasure of the committee? I would definitely recommend that we hold this item in committee and that we look to lean on our city staff to bring forward and together the stakeholders to have this discussion about how we move forward. I like the idea of including Councilmember Larson's idea about the possibility of sort of shifting, if I use the word correctly, other handicapped spaces to other areas that may not be utilized in others. So if we just take a look at what can be done there, I know it's not in the ordinance as currently presented, but we do have some flexibility. Is there anything that we're going to ask our staff to bring back to us about this, Councilmember McIntosh?
Let me ask a procedure question. Do we need to have all the stakeholder input in before we approve this? Can we approve this based on moving forward and getting feedback from the community?
Yeah, I think,
Certainly you can, but if you want for us to go out and get input from the entities that have been mentioned, the Mayor's Commission, the Downtown Development folks, we could certainly do that and bring that information back to the committee before you make.
I don't think it makes any difference in the long run, but I'm thinking that if we
Probably good.
go ahead and say, okay, we agree with this, we realize that there's value here in doing this, we'll work out the details at the stakeholder level. It's not critical to do that by any means.
Councilmember Larson.
I think we're all committed to creating some handicap parking in the downtown area. Parking is a major problem, on-street parking. We got plenty of parking in the parking decks, but that isn't going to solve the handicap on-street parking. I am interested in trying to understand if there's not a possibility somewhere in the city for something, an event, a special event at the Stevens Center, Sawtooth Center, whatever, for them to have some discretion to set aside 5 spaces, 4 spaces, whatever, in close proximity to that event, to allow handicap parking on the night of that event without going through a major application process. So there's some mechanism that, based on their calendar and the use and the discretion of controlling their streets and their sidewalks and their area around their buildings, to be able to meet that need. I know, a lot of churches, for example, have put out handicap parking right in front of their church on Sunday mornings to allow them to park. I don't know whether they're doing that illegally now or whether that is something, that they're just doing or what. But that would address a certain need, particularly on nights that are heavily used downtown, that we need to somehow address that specific need on that specific night, and otherwise have a minimum sort of standard, which it sounds like the rest of this is about, of providing reasonable handicap accessibility. I love the idea that you can park there and stay there forever, you know, and not get ticketed, great. But if there's no parking space available, period, then you're driving around or you're going into the deck and it doesn't work. So, and you don't have the flexibility of walking 3 blocks or whatever to get to where you're going. So I still think we have to have on-street handicap parking at some level. But to meet a requirement for the kind of special events that we have, whether they be festivals or whether they be other things, that some planning for a supplemental handicap flexibility ought to be looked at for those pressure points. I guess is what I'm asking my colleagues here, as to whether we think we could arrange that and still control it, obviously. Some thought's going to have to be given to transportation and what have you to do that, because normally these are going to be metered spots or loading dock areas that are not used after hours. They could then be converted into handicap parking spaces or something at the discretion of the event.
Yeah.
Mayor Pro Tem Burke.
I was going to say the point he brings is it's meaningful. I'm going to tell you why. If you know the handicap spots, they fill up fast. And there are more handicapped people now that need those spaces. And so during special times with that particular agency or group who's having an activity, I think that's something we need to look into. Not, and come back and give some type of report.
Some discretion.
So we can see just what he's asking.
Yeah, and I just want to thank Councilman Larson for the suggestion. I think that's the point of us sitting down at the round table, discussing what we can and what we can't do, what we think about, putting our ideas on the table. And I think we're instructing the staff to go and take a look at that, bring that back to us, and then Councilman Larson will have that discussion at the next Public Safety Committee, and we'll talk about how we might be able to move forward with the concept. Fair enough, committee members? Councilmember McIntosh.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that on-street parking downtown is a limited resource. And so when you take a space away from a merchant to use it as handicap parking, you're going to have people cry foul over that too. So we need to be careful about what the balance is. And I don't think we know what that balance needs to be until we go to the stakeholder groups and they tell us. We typically, for a big event, we have this many spaces. But we need to sort of realize that those public spaces are public right now. We don't want to disadvantage of somebody else in the process.
Well, they are, except that they are merchants. They are customers as well. You know, so, I mean, it's a question of, I understand exactly. And I'm trying to find that balance between setting aside every day a parking place there versus when you have special needs particularly. That's what I'm looking at. Sorry,
Councilman Larson.
May I?
Please do.
Sorry. I think it's important, too, as soon as we can, to begin to look at the density and parking locations, and I don't know how deeply you want to bore down in this, but I think it's important that the location of these individual, one per block, if that's what we got, then the location of that to match what you're talking about, the merchant's concern versus the real logistics of how you get in and out of a car and handicap accessibility, and where the handicap ramps are and the other components that we're dealing with, which is what Mr. Turner was talking about, has got to be looked at. And I think the sooner we can begin to put those little blue dots on the road, I'd like to see that as soon as possible, too. And we need to move this thing forward. I don't want to get it bogged down in committee too much, but get the constituents involved, and if you guys want to act as a review, I'm totally fine.
Well, I'll conclude by saying this is the City of Arts and Innovation. I think we have people of all shapes, sizes, and diversities in this city. We want to be respectful of our young people. We want to be respectful of our seniors and our more seasoned citizens. We want to be respectful of those who don't have handicaps and those who do. So I think this is a good discussion. There are decent ideas put on the table on how we move forward. We will investigate them. We will speak with our stakeholders. We will come back and make a designed, informed decision for the greater good of the people in the community. Is there anything further on this particular item?
We're going to hold this.
We will hold this in committee, investigate everything that we've talked about, and discuss this in January if that's feasible. Mr. Turner, Mr. Manager, thank you. Is there anything else on this item? I appreciate all the conversation. Members of the committee, that concludes the consent agenda. Item G1 and G2 have been held, so there's no need to discuss those. And we've just held item G3 in committee. Is there any further business that needs to be discussed for the good of the order? Seeing that there is none, we'll consider this Public Safety Committee meeting to be adjourned. Thank you.